Now, the start of this week was dominated by the government's investment summit. We've already mentioned it briefly, which seems to have been designed to calm nerves before the budget. But the second half of the week has seemingly been wild budget speculation. Now, Andrew, we played a bit of your interview with the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, last week. And if you want to hear that episode, it's called Rachel Reeves on Who Will Foot the Budget Bill. And it's also today's magazine cover. And she hinted pretty strongly to you that we are going to see this employers' national insurance contribution go up. We haven't heard your reaction to that interview yet. I mean, what stood out for you?
Well, that stood out for me. For one thing, I think two other lines really stood out for me. One is her insistence, and she really meant this to come over because she repeated it several times, that when the budget is published, everybody will see that those with the broadest shoulders are shouldering the heaviest burden. So in other words, this is going to be a, quotes, progressive, quotes, budget in terms of taxation. Second, I thought her account of what happened when she came into the Treasury in July, and this was in the context of me pressing her on the winter fuel allowance cut, which I have said already I think was a big mistake and the wrong thing to do. She sort of basically said, you have no idea of the atmosphere of panic when I came in, and she did that thing about they had to raise £22 billion in government bonds. They're already halfway through the year. The OBR don't know about it. The Debt Management Office don't know about it. Parliament doesn't know about it. The media doesn't know about it. And she has to go to Parliament and announce this. And the officials are telling her that halfway through the year, at the interest rates, they're not going to be able to do this. It did begin to sound to me a little bit like the possibility of a second Liz Truss meltdown was there inside the economy in the middle of the year. And that would explain why, if she was looking for very short-term measures to announce and to calm the bond markets, she might have gone for that. So those are the two things.
And you could hear that in her voice, actually. When we were talking about it on the podcast last week, Rachel and I, that stood out to both of us as well, that it sounded, really genuine, the shock that they
She was
felt
suddenly leaning over the table, eyeballing me in a very significant way, I felt. So there was that. And on the national insurance for employers rise, which I do think is coming, I said to her, look, there's been all this speculation, but you said in the manifesto, we are not going to raise national insurance, period. And she looked at me and she said, we said we are not going to raise taxes on working people such as national insurance. And I said, OK, well, that means you've got an extra 16 billion quid to play with then. And she just said, we will lay it all out in the budget, which seemed to me to be as clear an acknowledgement of what's going to happen as I have heard.
Today, Will, the rumours are very much about capital gains tax, and what's being reported is that government is not going to increase this, as once speculated, on the sale of second homes, but it is going to put up the rate on the sale of shares. That likely and sensible?
So I think capital gains tax is a very difficult thing to forecast in terms of how much money it's going to raise. Because if you're telling people in advance or signalling to people in advance that it is going to go up, especially from quite liquid assets like shares, then people are going to crystallise those gains before it happens.
As we saw with the next CEO, Simon Wolfson's.
Yeah. And similarly, with some of the plans that they
allegedly
have for inheritance tax, could also involve closing some loopholes around owning and passing on certain kinds of shares. So again, you might see people selling up those and transferring them. But I mean, it's not. There aren't loads of other assets that will reward you in the same way for holding them. So you need to do it in such a way that you tell people that they're not going to lose that much money, and there's not going to be that many other ways for them to make the same amount of money from their investments in order to be able to get the gains for the government and not have them all crystallise elsewhere in other markets. So it is a very tricky thing to set. What you don't want to do is signal to people that you're going to raise it too high, too far in advance, because then it will all just go. And when you get there, you'll have a nice high rate of tax on something that nobody is actually selling. On the other hand, you don't want to sort of go too low and just sort of leave it to people and then not actually make any money out of doing it.
We are still almost 2 weeks from the budget, Andrew, and yet this attempt to sort of calm nerves has launched us into endless speculation, like we're talking about here, capital gains tax, and then this debate about breaching manifesto promises on national insurance. Do you think it's a problem for Labour? Is it have they just handled this badly? Not in terms of what they're actually going to do, but the messaging.
So this is a really difficult question you just asked me there, Hannah, and I've been turning it around in my mind for a long while, because on the one hand, yes, they're getting days and days and days of not very good publicity. On the national insurance thing, for instance, I spoke to Jonathan Ashworth, who was in the room as they were writing the manifesto, and he was very clear that they had deliberately left open that gap, and he pointed out that during the election campaign, the Conservatives, Laura Trott and her colleagues from the Treasury team actually held a press conference to highlight this specific point and said, look, they're going to put up employers' national insurance. And the Labour Party was asked about this and didn't deny it during the election campaign. So, I mean, I think the language they use in the manifesto is deliberately opaque, as manifesto language often is, but I don't think you can really say that they lied to the public during the election campaign about this. On the wider point, do you, as it were, roll the pitch? Do you get the bad news out there first? Do you kind of get all the alarmed headlines? And then when the budget comes out, lots of people feel a mild sense of relief, even if it's a tough budget. That's one way of looking at it, not stupid politics. But on the other hand, this has gone on now for a very, very long time. And we now have, departments who are facing big spending cuts, perhaps, leaking and briefing to the press about how upset they are. And that's not a great look for Rachel Reeves.
I think it shows how concerned they are about a repeat of the Truss Kwarteng incident. I think it shows how keen they are to telegraph to markets, to the bond market, their plans, to give everybody an opportunity to factor into the decisions that they're going to make, the policies that might happen without actually announcing them first. I think that's quite sensible.
You could say they're sort of stress testing budget policies before announcing them.
Yeah. Because, I mean, what bond markets tend to reward in a budget is fundamentally austerity. That's what investors want. They don't necessarily really want you to go for growth, because bond market decisions they're not made on. It's not like investing in a company where you say, oh, it looks like this company's going to do really well, so we'll buy some of their shares. It's a decision made on the basis where you think that country's interest rates are going to head in relation to where the interest rates of other countries are going to head, because bond investors are either buying US treasuries or UK gilts or the bonds of other countries.
Yeah, and I mean, the sorry to interrupt, but the eminent economist Paul Collier has just written for the New Statesman today. It's online, saying that actually we are one of the most stable countries economically now. When you look at how we compare to our competitors.
Well, I was talking to Mohammed El-Erian, who's another very, very eminent economist who was with the Alliance for a long time. He's now at Cambridge. And he said, just look at Germany and what's going on there in the German economy. Look at France and look at the proposals, by the way, on wealth taxes in France at the moment. And you see there is this rather rare window where Britain does look like a very sensible place to be investing, which is why I think you got so many people like Fink and others from the private equity world pouring into London and lavishing praise on Keir Starmer.
Well, busy week for you. Not only are you writing about fat jabs, you gave us your analysis of that investment summit. And I just want to ask you about, there's all this talk about whether the fiscal rules will change to allow for more investment. What did we learn from Monday about Labour's approach to investment?
Well, so Rachel Reeves has talked about the upcoming budget being a budget for investment, and she's talked about setting fiscal policy or setting budgets that count the costs but also recognise the benefits. So again, she is telegraphing to investors and of all kinds that what they're going to do is prioritise borrowing for investment, and the hope is that public spending therefore crowds in private investment, creates jobs and grows the economy. There are two fiscal rules that definitely won't change. The first is that the government is not going to borrow to finance its day-to-day spending. And the second is that the long-standing fiscal rule that debt as a proportion of GDP should be falling by between year 4 and year 5 of the Parliament. So that is a weird rule that means you can get debt up over the next couple of years, and then as long as you get it falling from that point, then you're okay. But what might change is how they measure that debt.
I can remember our colleague Freddie Hayward, now in Washington for us, saying again and again they could just extend it to 10 years, not 5, and give themselves a lot more wriggle room. But I agree there doesn't seem to be any sign at all that she's going to do that, though she might reallocate assets in a different way to give herself some more space.
Yeah, I think the easier and potentially very effective way of doing it is to, on the national balance sheet, change what column you put certain figures in. So all of our listeners will, of course, be familiar with the PSND ex BOE measure.
Oh, yeah,
used. Yeah, classic.
I think just for those who might not, just remind us what it is.
So that's public sector net debt, excluding the Bank of England, debt to the Bank of England. But there are other measures that you can use. PSNFL, of course, PSNW. So anyway, these are different ways of measuring things whereby
We're getting a glimpse into your life here.
Yeah, it's all acronyms. You can, for example, say that you know certain parts of the government or government-owned bodies can borrow, and that's not counted as being the national debt and things like that. And that that debt rule where you say, oh, we're going to get debt down by year 5, you don't know where debt is going to be at that point because it all depends on, you don't know how much you're going to be spending, you don't know how much your borrowing is going to cost and that kind of thing. So changing how you account things is perfectly rational. You can say this is more accurate, and as a bonus, it lets us borrow more money.
As we've got you, I think this is probably the ideal time to ask this question that we've had in from Niriop. I can't think of any other pronunciation. They've been in touch and they said, how can the government square wanting more investment while cutting state investment in real terms?
Well, yeah, I mean, that is, it's a good question. And I think it's an important one for Rachel Reeves to answer because the amount that she said that was going to go into the National Wealth Fund at this investment summit was actually a fair bit less than they had originally planned. So it's been, the amount going in has been cut from 7.3 billion to 5.8 billion. And those aren't huge sums in the grand scheme of things. And even if you're hoping that you're going to bring in £3 of private investment for every £1 of public investment, which I think is the target that the fund has, that's not a vast amount in the grand scheme of things. So what a lot of people, like, for example, the New Economics Foundation think should be done is that the fund should be able to issue its own bonds, as the wealth funds of some other countries do. And in that way, you could raise maybe 100 billion and crowd in another 300 billion if you're meeting your targets. And then you have a lot more to invest in infrastructure. And the idea is that would then hopefully lead to a reason that companies decide to do things like building a new factory and employing a load more people is because there are, train lines that run to it and good roads and a good supply of healthy, skilled workers nearby. So the more investment you get from private companies, the more, it has a compounding effect. So, yeah, I think it's a good question to say that looks a lot more difficult if you're only putting in these individual sums that are raised sort of from central government rather than letting the fund raise its own capital.